emerging trends in India's foreign policy. It is engagement with the West. But in the past, we have seen that India had followed a policy of non-alignment and strategic independence, keeping a distance from Western alliances. Now we are witnessing a very readjustment within these traditions, and we have a very cooperative relationship with the West. And today, to reflect upon this very current topic, we have invited one of the eminent professors of our country, Professor Amiya Kumar Paricha, former head and professor of the Department of Political Science, Berhampur University. And we have invited Professor Paricha on different occasions to share his academic wisdom with us. And Professor Paricha is a very good professor in political science, and uh, Professor Paricha, after completing his PhD in 1985, has joined in the PG department about 30 years, and he retired as a professor from Berhampur University, and then he also acted as a professor emeritus for about another 5 years. And Professor Paricha has a couple of books to his credits. He has contributed many research articles to different national and international uh, journals. He has also produced 15 number of PhD students. It is a very glorious achievement for him. He has also guided 50 number of MPhil students, and he has done a tremendous work when he was the professor of political science in Berhampur University, and he has been associated with different forums, and he has taken the responsibility of the university on different sectors. I don't want to reflect upon all the things. So we are very fortunate that Professor Paricha given his consent to be a speaker that is on today's webinar. So we now we extend our gratitude to Professor Paricha to accept our invitation. And today, on this occasion, I bow down my head before Paricha. And today we have with us Professor Vishnu Prasad Chaudhary sir, um, Professor Radhanatha Behra sir, and many other senior professors of political science and other disciplines. They are with us. They will extend their academic observation with us. They will share their academic query and mm, and and guidance. Okay, and we will accept all the observation of the senior professors. So with this, once again, I extend my pranam to all the senior teachers of political science, philosophy, and other disciplines. I welcome Professor Dr. K. Omnan Rao, the moderator, and I extend my welcome to Professor Pramod Kumar Das, the real architect of the philosophy family. And once again, I extend my welcome to all of you and request Professor Paricha to commence his talk on this topic. Over to Professor Paricha.
Esteemed convener, Dr. Pramod Kumar Das, I hope I am audible to all. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Sir, audible, sir. Audible and visible, sir.
Okay. And moderator, Dr. K. Om Narayan Rao, coordinator, Dr. K.C. Maharana, and distinguished participants present today in the evening. Indeed, It's a matter of great pleasure for me to be here amongst a galaxy of luminaries and sharing my thought on emerging trends on in India's foreign policy. We are meeting after a long time, and I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present my views. So once again, I thank the organizers and distinguished participants present here. For the purpose of my today's presentation, I have divided my presentation into four different parts. The first part would be very briefly dealing with evolution of India's foreign policy during pre-independence period. Second part would be from 1947 to 1991. Third part would be from 1991 to 2008. And the concluding part would deal with the events that have been taking place from 2008 till to date on different dimensions of international politics. So to begin with, the organized way of nations coming together to act and behave in international politics, it started with the conclusion of Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 years of war in Europe, and the nations they realized that they had fought enough. Now there is a need for reorganization and reconstruction, and that is how, in a very brief manner, the idea of nations coming together to a common platform to act at international level, that was initiated, and that was in a rudimentary phase. And from 1648 till the advent of colonial rule in different parts of the world, mostly led by Britain, although there were other colonies too, but it was British colonialism which dominated the whole world, and there was a popular saying that British Empire was so vast that sun had never set. I need not elaborate on this particular issue, but what is more important is that the colonialism had spread to such an extent that initially it originated in the form of an economic interaction, but later the political aspect also had originated, and all over the world there emerged a trend that there is a need to fight to bring an end to colonialism. And I would say that the first initiative was taken by Indian National Congress, which began in 1885, although in a very preliminary way. But the primary attempt of Indian National Congress was to create an awareness, not only in India, but in other parts of the world where there was dissatisfaction growing among different colonies to bring an end to colonialism. And it was at that time a young man called Jawaharlal Nehru emerged into the picture. He had British educational background with him, and when he came back to India, Indian National Congress opened a international division dealing with international issues, and Jawaharlal Nehru was made the president of that organization. And that gave Jawaharlal Nehru a platform to initiate and create a global public opinion against colonialism. And that is how India's inauguration into analyzing international issues and uniting nations fighting on similar basis against colonialism. And that marked exactly the beginning of initiation of India's approach to international issues. And Nehru always used to say that the struggle which Indian National Congress has initiated is not aimed to bring or it is not aimed to fight against a particular nation, but it is aimed to unite people to fight for certain principles, certain causes like restoration of democracy. And Nehru believed that colonialism leads to infringing on human freedom, encroaches human dignity, and above all, it restricts the freedom of speech, which are the three pillars of democratic processes. So Nehru used to say that wherever human freedom is encroached, human dignity is threatened, Indian National Congress is bound to make its presence felt to unite people suffering similarly in different parts of the world. And for the information of learned participants here, I would like to say that the initiative which Indian National Congress has taken, similar kind of initiative also had originated in different parts of the world where people were trying to create a global public opinion against colonialism and restoration of democracy and restoration of people's rule in the respective states. That is how the initiative started by Indian National Congress. And the second part, this is very briefly, I am presenting an overview of how uh, India's foreign policy evolved. So the evolution of foreign policy was basically on restoring human dignity, allowing individuals to choose their own government, and above all, to preserve what is called as sovereignty and human dignity, which are the basic pillars or which are the basic components of a democratic processes, and India was not an exception to that. And when India became independent, Nehru was aware, and I would like to say that when Lord Curzon visited for the first time in India, he said that the geographical location that India enjoys in future, even if India is not prepared to play a dominant role, her geographical location will push India to play an important role. And the prediction that he made when he visited the first time in India, and that has come true today because of the prominence that India enjoys at international level, the way India is capable of influencing international events, not only at the regional level but also at the global level, that learned participants are more aware about it, and I need not elaborate on that. So taking that into account, Nehru was the first leader who was aware of this kind of geographical advantage that India enjoys. And he, even much before India became independent, just before the end of the Second World War, Nehru was very much aware that sooner or later India is going to get her independence, and he tried to pursue a kind of an approach based on the common factors that Indian National Congress leaders had formulated in matters of international relations. And he was aware that after the end of the war, the world would be divided into two important components, that is, United States and later the Soviet Union. And Nehru was aware that it would be prudent on the part of India not to be aligned with either of the blocs and to maintain an independent approach. But he knew India's limitation because India had just attained independence, and in matters of international relations, India was just a baby. And Nehru was aware that the baby needs a social protection, and that social protection Nehru formulated was that not to be aligned with either of the blocs. And when India would not be aligned with either of the blocs, that would give India an autonomy of a choice to choose a means whereby neither it could dissatisfy the Americans nor it could displease the Soviets. So Nehru wanted to maintain an independent approach, and it was against that background that American foreign, because after the Second World War, all learned participants are aware that America emerged as one of the most dominant power capable of influencing because it had nuclear weapons with it, and the Allied powers had won the war, and America enjoyed the advantage. And the military dominant position that America enjoyed, American foreign policy makers thought that it is time to expand America's geographical influence, and they came out with a policy that America, they said to the whole world, particularly newly independent nations who got independence between 1945 and 50. All of you know that around 95% of the countries of the world today are democracies. And America said to the newly independent countries that you are just a small baby in international politics. You need social protection. So you join with us, and we will protect your political system, we will take care of your security, we will take care of our economic development, but on one condition, that you have to consider our enemy as your enemy. It was at this point that Nehru disagreed with the United States, and Nehru asked who is the enemy. So Americans said it is the Soviets. So it was an ideological warfare between United States and Soviet Union, that is capitalism versus communism. So Nehru said that communism in no circumstances is a threat to democracy, and we don't accept the American argument that communism is a great threat to democracy and America's role as protector of democracy. It was at this time that in 1948, between 1947 and 1949, Nehru convened two ASEAN Relations Conference, and his idea was to unite all the ASEAN countries together to form a common platform wherein combinedly they can initiate a common program of action in dealing with international issues and find out certain common issues. And in doing so, Nehru thought that there was much common among all the ASEAN countries. And when he attempted to convene ASEAN Relations Conference, he included China also because he said that he believed that any initiative that is to be taken can be more successful only when China is included. And in doing so, he was influenced by two important considerations. The first consideration was that Nehru said that all the Asian countries had a common historical experience of being ruled by colonialism and exploited. And all of them had won their independence through a freedom struggle. And second factor was religion as a factor. As learned participants present here know that Hinduism was the dominant religion, but the greatness of Hinduism was that it not only grew, but allowed other religions also to grow. Like say Islam, a foreign religion, came to India and became a powerful force. Christianity came to India and became a major power, and ultimately they ruled us and exploited. That is a different part. Buddhism originated in India, went to different parts of Asia and flourished. Jainism. So world's major religions were in Asia, and Nehru believed that it was the religion and culture which has united all the Asian countries together. Hence, that can be utilized as a common platform to initiate a common program of action, wherein the Asian countries can play a major role as a bloc in international politics. But unfortunately, Nehru's initiatives did not materialize results the way Nehru wanted or the way Indian foreign policy makers they wanted. And 2 years after that, it followed the peak period of Cold War, which started with 1951, and so 51 to 61. That the decade was extremely important because it was not only the intense phase of Cold War, but That decade also gave rise to one of the most powerful movements in the world, that is the non-aligned movement, which was a intercontinental movement because it's not only confined in Asia, African countries, Latin American countries, different parts of the world, they became members. And all of them, they realized that non-aligned movement can be formed as a common platform to initiate action in preventing the American dominance. So when American foreign policy makers realized that India was gradually slipping out of its hand in terms of its American foreign policy perspectives, then the next country which was geographically enjoying a better position after India was Pakistan. And that is how the honeymoon between India and Pakistan started. And the rest, all of the learned participants know the kind of intimacy, diplomatic intimacy, military relationship, economic strength that Pakistan had gained in between was the result of American contribution, and that is how the great divide between India and United States started. And the more and more the divide emerged, more and more India became closer to Soviet Union in terms of strategic requirement, in terms of economic initiatives, and in terms of security perspectives as well. And that is how India's foreign policy was going through a crucial phase. And it was at this moment that in 1964, when China became a nuclear power, the British, the American-led alliance realized that now it is time to initiate steps to see that at least proliferation of nuclear weapons do not take place. And against that background, the NPT had emerged, and India was one of the members of the committee which drafted the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Mrs. Gandhi attended that. And Mrs. Gandhi later emerged as Iron Lady of international politics, and she was very firm in her approach. And she said that our policy is universal disarmament, and we welcome any international initiative which prevents the spread of nuclear weapons. So we welcome it. But we have certain conditions. And Mrs. Gandhi said that the first condition is that we don't have any nuclear weapons. And we expect a nuclear China as a threat to India's security. And when that happens, that is when China would plan for a nuclear attack against India, other nuclear powers should come to the rescue of India, which Mrs. Gandhi said as nuclear guarantee. Then America and other nuclear powers, particularly France, Britain, and others, they said that we are not in a position to give such kind of guarantee. The second tough condition that NPT put was that if a country signs the NPT, it surrenders its autonomy to conduct any nuclear test, and also it would allow the nuclear installation for international inspection by an international agency known as International Atomic Energy Agency. It was at this time that even Mrs. Gandhi said that we are not prepared for such kind of surrendering our autonomy for conducting nuclear research, because Nehru was the great initiator, and he always used to believe that it is the science which can be used for development, and it is the scientific technology and nuclear research that can lead to a new kind of a scientific revolution. That is what Nehru believed, because he had a scientific bent of mind. And Mrs. Gandhi continued that legacy, and she was very firm about the imposition of restrictions on India's nuclear autonomy. And it was at this time that we had a war with Pakistan in 1971 because of the refugee crisis of Bangladesh, which was followed by elections in Pakistan. where Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's party won a majority and Pakistan military rulers and mostly supported by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and others, they were not in a position to transfer political power to Awami League. And what followed the rest is history, and that led to the creation of not only Bangladesh but also opened a new chapter in India's foreign policy because just before the war, India had entered into an agreement with Soviet Union, popularly known as Indo-Soviet Peace and Friendship Treaty. And one of the most important clause of that treaty was that in future, if India's integrity is threatened, Soviet Union would come to the rescue of India. So that was the dividing point where which marked the emergence of India as a regional power because 3 years after that, India had conducted a nuclear underground test, which had resulted in tremendous negative international reaction among the Committee of Nations, and there were a lot of sanctions on India's nuclear research. And the nuclear test at Pokhran of 1974 was the turning point in Indo-Pakistan relations because in Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was the foreign minister at that time, and he was addressing the military commanders at Rawalpindi immediately after the conference when the journalist asked that India had just conducted a nuclear test and what is your reaction? And Bhutto, in his own typical manner, he replied that Christians had the bomb, the Jews had the bomb, and now Hindus have acquired the bomb, and it is now the turn of the Muslims. And he coined it as an Islamic bomb, and he said that Pakistan would manufacture or produce a nuclear bomb which would protect the entire Islamic community. So that was not only the turning point, but also it was one of the most important agenda for America because America started not only protecting Pakistan interest but also projecting Pakistan as a regional power to counter India's rise at the regional level. And it was at this time that I would again like to take back to the learned participants to India's relations with the neighbors. And if we look into the map of the South Asia, India is surrounded by the neighbors, the eight SARC members. Afghanistan was the latest entry. And if we take also China, then these are the countries which surround South of Asia. And India is the only, if we exclude China, India is the only country which has common border with all the neighbors, whereas other neighbors do not share common border with India. And again, if we take the entire history of India's relations with our neighbors, Pakistan, I'm not going to deal more without it because learned participants are more aware about it. But if we take about Sri Lanka, Nepal, or even Bangladesh, these are the prominent countries with whom our relationship has been at the top, then again coming back to the bottom, and now in a different path altogether. And it was because of, if you look at the situation now in South Asia, we'll find that there is rising China, and China has diplomatically encircled India in such a way that now India is diplomatically in a web, which is struggling to come out of it. Because Nepal, one of the closest allies of India, has moved much closer to China. Maldives, again, everybody is aware about it. Sri Lanka, there is absolute Chinese dominance. And in Bangladesh, the recent disturbances that had taken place, which was purely a domestic event, but turned out to be an international event which brought an end to the so-called regime of Begum Zia, and that had led to such a kind of a situation where the independent interest of observers have an opinion that now India is in search of her identity in South Asia, even though SARC for quite some time was a major powerful regional movement, but the momentum could not be picked up. I am reminded of when this SARC was formed, I am reminded of the most successful regional organization, that is European Union, which initially existed as European Common Market, and now it's European Union. And Indian leaders and South Asian leaders were mostly influenced by such kind of a consideration of the successful story of European Union. But if we take into account the European Union and SARC, European Union has an advantage, that is they are bounded by a common religion. Their level of economic development is almost very much similar. They have a political process which enjoys greater autonomy in the policy making process, and they have a strong economic integration which has projected them as one of the most powerful economic bloc now in Asia. Whereas such kind of experiment, when it was conducted among the South Asian nations, it was never successful because it began with a negative element, because India, in terms of her size, her capability, her development, manpower, resources, technology, India was number one. Other nations, weak in military capability, except perhaps Pakistan, they had always a negative approach towards India, that India, by virtue of her size and by virtue of her dominance, would always dominate the proceeding nation, and that is how the negative element which movement was, though originated with much fanfare, but its success story was in different parts of the world, whether it was Organization of African Union or whatever regional organizations that we take into account, or ASEAN among the Southeast Asian nations. And after Indo-Pak War, there emerged two important movements at the international level initiated by India. That was North-South dialogue, which was one of the most prominent policy approach by India, where India pointed out to the developed North that you have all infrastructure, technology, and we have resources. Take our resources, give your technology. We will utilize the technology to develop commonly shared between North and the South, and that was never acceptable to the developed North. The second concept that India developed at that time was new international economic order, which was one of the most powerful concepts that became very much popular among all the developing countries who were trying to unite because they wanted to create a kind of a economic order. So the economy as a factor emerged as one of the international dominant factor after the disintegration of Soviet Union. But it was the developing nations led by India, which once economic development is ensured, stability would automatically come, and that would strengthen different political process in different parts of the world, irrespective of the ideology or irrespective of the party that has come to power or that is coming to power in different parts of the world, not only now but also in the past. In that process, the 80s was extremely important because that marked the realization between America and Soviet Union. For the information of the learned participants, I would like to emphasize on that 80s was very much important because if we take into account the nuclear capability, American nuclear capability, nuclear strength is influenced by the doctrine, the doctrine of defensive weapon, whereas Soviet nuclear technology and nuclear weapon development is based on offensive. That is, Soviet Union only can attack but cannot defend nuclear war. Whereas America can defend any nuclear attack, but America cannot attack and completely destroy its opponent, particularly Soviet Union. So, for example, if a war takes place now between United States and America, and let us assume that the war is going to be a nuclear war, then Soviet Union would enjoy a little advantage because in terms of numbers, Russia now has more number of weapons and all these weapons are offensive weapons. That is, it can attack and destroy any nuclear installation, any nuclear capability of United States. And it was in 1980 that Ronald Reagan realized this concept and he developed a concept of Star War, wherein he developed a strategy that all the nuclear weapons of United States would be kept in the air, not on the ground or not on the sea, and that would protect the Soviet nuclear attack on America. And unfortunately, the Star Wars program, the word was easy, but when its implementation part came, the financial burden on America was so huge that American economy could not accept that kind of a economic pressure. And American economists believe that that marked American decline, economic decline of America. But America emerged as one of the most economic dominant power because the dollar continued to be one of the most important international exchange in terms of trade. That 80s period, the end of the 80s marked a greater dissatisfaction about communism as an ideology, and communism was gradually becoming weak, and it was reflected in 1991 when the Soviet Union ultimately disintegrated. So till 1991, there was some kind of international observers they point out that there was some kind of stability in international relations because America and Soviet Union were capable of providing a balance in terms of strategy, and that prevented a kind of a tension situation everywhere. Although regional wars took place at different places, wherein American interest was greatly involved. So this suited more to the Chinese because America and Russia were deeply involved in the nuclear competition. China remained silent and silently it developed its infrastructure, military capability, economic strength, and the result it paid to the Chinese was after 90s. So after 90s, what we find, 91, when Soviet Union disintegrated, world became unipolar. And that was a problem for all countries to formulate their foreign policy, to readjust their foreign policy. Because till 1991, the foreign policy of different countries, including India, was centered around taking into account America, that is NATO as an alliance, and Soviet Union, that is Warsaw Pact. And Indian approach was to oppose any kind of a military alliance and to pursue an independent approach, which would give a relative autonomy to Indian foreign policy makers, not only to pursue an independent approach, but also to retain their freedom, retain their autonomy, retain their independence in formulating the foreign policy at the international level. And it was at this time that 1990s, as I have said, that it led to creating a disintegration of Soviet Union, led to creating a vacuum in international relations. And the vacuum was so huge that there was nobody immediately available to fill that vacuum to counter American pressure. Because the Chinese national interest was something different. Chinese policy was never to directly interfere militarily in any part, rather to expand through the supply of goods and capturing the market. And the fluid situation that prevailed between 1991 to 2002, Chinese foreign policy makers, Chinese national leaders exploited that to their favor to such an extent that today we see the Chinese dominance everywhere, in every field, everywhere around the world, whether it is economy or technology, transport, military, science, technology, pharmaceuticals, any aspect that one would take, we find the Chinese dominance. There is no doubt about that. That was as far as 1991 to 2000. In 2000 to 2008, that marked the most fluid situation because that marked the rise of different economic power centers in different parts of the world. In South Asia, Southeast Asia, Singapore, Japan, even Thailand, Taiwan, different smaller powers emerged as economic powerhouse, and they were termed as Asian tigers. In South America, it was Brazil. In Europe, it was unified Germany, East and West Germany, which was united. East Germany had the best of Soviet Union, West Germany had the best of America. So Germany enjoyed the advantage of having the best from the Eastern world and the Western world, and Germany emerged as one of the most powerful economic powerhouse as far as international politics was concerned. It was amidst this background that Indian policymakers they tried to outreach the world because till 1991 the approach of Indian foreign policymakers was the region which was far away from India do not attract immediate attention. But the 1991 situation, disintegration of Soviet Union and the rise of economic factor as one of the dominant factors that opened up new aspects of India's foreign policy making process. And Indian foreign policy makers they realize that it is not the strategic factor or a military factor that is going to help, but it is the emphasis on economic factor and playing the diplomatic cards economically in a prudent manner that is going to provide a greater advantage to a nation than anything else. That was followed by fast movement of events of globalization, then World Trade Organization, and the 2008 economic meltdown, where almost all the countries of the world were influenced negatively by the economic meltdown that emerged immediately between 2005 and 2008. And the only two countries that survived the economic meltdown was United States and China. So they enjoyed the advantage of not being influenced by the negative factors of economic slowdown, and that marked the dominance. And during that period, the international affairs was described as a unipolar world led by United States of America, and no other country was either mentally prepared or one or two countries which had the capability but they were not prepared to fill the vacuum created by Soviet Union, and that provided a greater strategic and diplomatic advantage to America for its outreach to different parts of the world. Today, if we look at the different regional conflicts, perhaps United States is more involved in different regional conflicts in different parts of the world than any other country. And the Next other country which is capable of challenging American dominance is Russia, which itself is involved in Ukraine crisis. So it is the China which is not involved in any kind of direct military conflicts, and that from 2008 till to date had provided a greater advantage and greater stability to China. And today, I need not elaborate to the learned members. The rest is history. Then the last part of my presentation is about different regional conflicts and how India has responded to it. If we take it first about the Ukraine crisis, it was India which for a initial period had played its diplomatic card more successfully in getting uninterrupted oil supply from Russia as well as from Ukraine at a discounted price. I say initially why? Because the agreement between Russia and India was that India would enjoy the uninterrupted supply of discounted crude supply. India need not pay in terms of either by ruble or dollar, but India would play in terms of Indian currency. So the agreement stipulated that Russia would open an account in Indian bank and India would open an account in Russian bank, and the oil that India gets, the equivalent amount would be deposited in Indian rupee in Russian country, and the amount of export that Russia would take from India, Russia would deposit the same amount of money in terms of ruble in an Indian bank. So India has purchased huge amount of oil to such an extent that there are billions of rupees lying unutilized in Russian bank, and Russia is now negotiating with India as to how to come out of that crisis because Indian rupee is not convertible in international market. So Russian government is finding it very difficult that the huge amount of Indian money that is deposited in Russian bank, how to convert that into an international currency which would be suitable to both India and Russia. That has been one of the most important dominant issue between India and Russia in one aspect. The second aspect I would like to deal very briefly about the current West Asian crisis. The current West Asian crisis bears a greater importance for India because we depend on West Asia for our energy security. Around 78% of our energy security we are dependent on West Asia. So any kind of a unstable strategic situation, either a war or a war-like conflict situation, and now if we take into account West Asia, the direct confrontation that is going on between Israel and Iran, that is going to be have a greater impact on India's energy security because there are three important sea connectivity which experiences around 80% of international trade. India has a opening to international sea through Andaman coast. From Andaman coast it is the Malacca Strait. From Malacca Strait we enter into the Bali Islands, which is Indonesia, then South China Sea. So when you go to South China Sea, around 500 kilometers after South China Sea, there is Gulf of Oman, which is a small strait that connects between Indian Ocean to Pacific Ocean. And another 100 kilometers beyond that, there is Strait of Hormuz, which is the only sea opening for the Gulf oil to enter into the international water. So India's 70% of crude oil and global 50% of crude oil transport takes place through from Persian Gulf through Strait of Hormuz to Arabian Sea, from Arabian Sea to South China Sea, from South China Sea to Malacca Strait, then it comes to Andaman Islands. From Andaman Ocean, it goes to different parts of the country, including Pakistan. And China enjoys an advantage in this region because China has constructed and developed a port in Sri Lanka known as Hambantota, which provides a direct entry to Sri Lanka into the Indian Ocean, then to the Pacific Ocean, then to Atlantic and any different parts of the world. And India is constructing a port in Iran, which is nearer to the Gadar port, which China has constructed in Pakistan, which is around 170 kilometers. And from Gadar, one has to come to Andaman Ocean, then only it can enter into the Pacific Ocean or what is called a South China Sea and Pacific Ocean. And in Pacific Ocean, China enjoys a greater advantage because all the ASEAN countries, though economically they are a powerhouse, but they do not develop any military confrontation with China, and China enjoys a greater advantage in South China Sea, wherein China is being described as the headmaster of the South China Sea, which oversees the 70% of global economic activities. So it is here that India has to play its diplomatic card in such a prudent manner, whereby neither it displeases Israel nor it displeases Iran and Saudi Arabia, because Iran and Saudi Arabia are in one geographical connectivity, and Iran and Saudi Arabia total they provide around 70% of India's oil requirement that comes to us from Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is a greater important ally of United States. So America would not tolerate any kind of diplomatic encroachment by India displeasing United States either on Israel or Gaza Strip or Iran. And the other part, that is my concluding part, there is some closer understanding between India and Iran in terms of dealing with counter-terrorism strategies, which is not acceptable to United States. Because American definition of countering terrorism has a different definition than what the nations who had suffered maximum through the terrorist attack. So these are going to be some of the important challenges because India has an unfavorable balance of trade. We depend more on international import than export. And over the last 5 years, our dependence on China has increased to such an extent that we are now the number one importer of the Chinese goods. We have overtaken United States. United States was the number one importer of Chinese goods. Now India is number one importer. So that is going to be an important challenge because as long as there is increasing independence on China in terms of our international trade, that would affect to some extent our strategic independence in terms of formulating our independent foreign policy. That is going to be one of the important emerging challenges. The second challenge that I foresee is that we depend around 83% of our energy security on external supply. So any kind of regional conflict that takes place in any part of the world, that is going to adversely affect economically in India's development. And once economic development is affected, that has a greater interlink to strategic independence and military autonomy. That is second challenge. The third challenge that Indian policymakers in future are likely to emerge is our 30% of our defense supply comes from Israel. Rest 40% of important defense supplies come from France and Russia. Rest 10% comes from different parts of the world like Sweden and other smaller countries. So the kind of strategic balance that Indian policymakers are trying to pursue and the role that India has been playing in dealing with Russia and the Ukraine crisis, Americans are not happy about it because America is more determined for eastward expansion of NATO and Soviet Union is more determined of preventing American expansion. And China is enjoying the developments that is taking place because China has an advantage that it has till now not involved in any kind of a military conflict. America has a greater involvement because America has to protect Israel and Saudi Arabia in West Asia to prevent terrorism in South Asia, more particularly Afghanistan and Pakistan, to protect Pakistan, to protect Bangladesh, to protect different South Asian regions from Chinese influence because there is no denying the fact that China has diplomatically encircled different regions. The only region that has remained free is Southeast Asia, where Indian foreign policymakers have pursued from look east to act east policy. But that is going to emerge as a challenge, as I have said, that about if we take into account unemployment rate, China enjoys a relative advantage of having less unemployment rate of around 3.2%. America has a unemployment percentage of about 5%. Russia has an unemployment percentage of around 5%, whereas India has an unemployment rate of around 8.7%. So settling the unemployment and providing employment opportunities to the youth is one of the important economic strategy which has a greater bearing on strategic initiative which China has successfully carried out the experiment and China has succeeded and that America is trying to implement that but has not been successful to a great extent because of its economic slowdown. So against this background, the different kind of challenges that India is facing about unfavorable balance of trade, excessive dependence on energy security, excessive dependence on stabilizing regional conflicts, which is not beyond the control of Indian policymakers. These are going to be the emerging trends of India's foreign policy in the coming years, and the coming decade would be very extremely crucial for Indian foreign policymakers in pursuing and formulating approaches to such an extent whereby it would be successful in maintaining a close balance among not only between the different regional powers in the world but also against the big powers. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation comes to an end and now it is open for debate.
Okay, thanks so much, sir, for your very comprehensive talk on emerging trends in India's foreign policy. Sir, you have made it very clear that how India's foreign policy has been evolving significantly over the past decades, shaping its role in global level. And you have given your stand on how India's foreign policy has undergone significant transformation from since independence and until now. You have covered that is the foreign policy during the Nehru's time and Indira Gandhi's time, and until now when Modi is ruling and Modi's foreign policy. And you have said that how India has adopted its strategic autonomy in pursuing independent foreign policy And you have also demonstrated that the multi-alignment and cooperation with the foreign countries like United States, Russia, China, European, etc., and taking the challenges of Pakistan, China, the regional security, and others. And you have given that how that India has seen the emerging trends, that it has tried to strengthen the regional ties with South Asian countries, and it has also tried to enhance the economic and strategic ties with South Asia, and it tries to expand the links with Central Asia countries, and tries to strengthen its strategic partnership with United States, with active participation in different current level programs taken by UNO and others. And you have very deeply reflected upon the how India has more cooperative relationship with Western countries, and you have very beautifully reflected upon embracing the defense and security and economic diplomacy. And last, you have given that how India is facing the emerging challenges, that is among its opportunities. And you have very clearly reflected on the regional conflicts that India wants to overcome with its independent foreign policy, taking the help of the other countries. And at last, you have said that the India's future foreign policy is in crisis, and it is very crucial for India to adopt a new foreign policy to be in part with other global countries, and India tries to be a global power in the future times. Thanks so much, sir, for your very good stand on this topic, and we appreciate and we extend our congratulations for your deep understanding and research on this topic, and we extend our gratitude to you, sir. Now, I would like to request Dr. K. Obnan Rao to reflect upon to carry on the interactive session. Over to Dr. Rao.
Namaskar, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Maharana, for the synopsis. I thank Dr. Amiya Paricha sir for a beautiful lecture. Well, I'll have my comments later on, but to start with, we have a great scholar in political science, Professor Vishnu Chaudhary sir. I request him to make note of the key points that Professor Amiya Paricha sir has discussed, and make his own observations, comments, and also suggestions, and also the queries that he carries in his mind, so that we can carry on the discussion further. So with these words, I request Professor Chaudhary to have his words. Namaskar, sir. Namaskar. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I congratulate my friend and colleague, Professor Paricha, for his nice lecture on the topic. And he has taken many issues into consideration. But he started his lecture on the evolution of India's foreign policy, particularly India's freedom struggle and what is the position that we got after independence. Then he talked about our national interests also and our position in the world at the time of independence. He laid emphasis on Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's role in shaping or formulating India's foreign policy. In fact, every prime minister after Nehru onwards has some role to play in influencing our foreign policy. Because in our parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister's position is different. And therefore, whether it was Indra Kumar Gujral or P.V. Narasimha Rao or Shastri, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, then Narendra Modi, everybody as Prime Minister has a role. But Professor Paricha laid emphasis on our non-alignment policy because after independence, we were not prepared to go either the Soviet way or the American way. We rejected both the groups raising their heads. Then he laid emphasis on our non-alignment policy, which talks about the Panchashil, meaning thereby mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference, equality and mutual benefit, and finally peaceful coexistence. But it is recognized by us, those who have studied Indian foreign policy, that we had some set principles. For example, we were against colonialism, we were against new colonialism, we were against imperialism, we were against racialism, we were against fascism and Nazism both, we were against war, we were against military blocs, and we wanted to shape our foreign policy under certain principles. For example, protection of human rights, protection of world peace and tranquility, negotiated settlement or negotiated peaceful settlement on international disputes, faith on international law. Then we have been opposing war as an instrument of foreign policy. Then we were also consistently fighting for peaceful use of nuclear technology. We have consistently believed in the UN system. Whatever disputes come in the world, we have to solve within the framework of the United Nations system. These have been the principles, and particularly even in the Constitution of India, under Article 51, we have indicated most of these principles, particularly on peace, negotiated settlement, that is there in Article 51 of the Constitution. But our foreign policy, like other countries of the world, is based on national interest. And we have always tried to protect our sovereignty and territorial integrity. So far as the foreign policy of India is concerned, one of the most important things that have to be talked about is a relationship with the neighbors. Professor Paricha have highlighted those things. I will not take your time, valuable time. But what is our relation with our neighbor China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Maldives, Nepal, and recently Afghanistan has also been in question because we share a common border with many of these countries. Then what is India's strength? Why India is respected? Number one, it has vast population. Number two, it has wide market. Number three, it has human and natural resources both, which are very important in the entire world. And India is the largest democracy in the world. These are our trump cards. And we have also the Indian knowledge system, which influences, particularly, we are a country where all the religions of the world, all the major religions of the world are present. That is there. Even our peaceful settlement is based on the influence of Buddhism and even to some extent our ancient tradition. Then Professor Paricha also talked about regional organizations. He mentioned about SARC framework and others. So finally, I would like to say that when we talk about India's foreign policy or India's role in the world, we must take into consideration different factors. I pinpoint those within 1 or 2 minutes. Number one, gone are the Cold War, or gone are the new Cold War period. We talked about a new international economic order, new international information order. Now we talk about the globalized world. In the globalized world, what should be the foreign policy of India? Then second issue is how far we are in a position to protect human rights. That is number two. Third is UN gives many mandates. How far India follows UN mandates on different issues. Fourth is how we are in a position to fight against global terrorism or cross-border terrorism, and how we join hands with those countries who are prepared to fight against terrorism and cross-border terrorism. Then what is our role in preserving world peace and tranquility? You know, recently our Prime Minister visited Russia, Ukraine. So how far we can end this war, or we can play a role in having a some sort of negotiation. Even in the Middle East, Professor Paricha was referring to Israel and Arab conflict, Arab countries, Iran, for example, or Hamas, for example, how we can play a role. Then another thing is in peacekeeping operations, what is India's role? Then seventh is in climate negotiations, because in the world today we have global problem like climate change, or what we call global warming. In different phases, we are fighting for some cause. And what is our role in climate negotiation? That is to be considered. Next is on nuclear non-proliferation. What is India's role? Then India's role in international trade and commerce. Then another thing is India's diaspora are there in different countries of the world. How far our foreign policy is being influenced by them, and how far Indian diaspora influence the foreign policy of other countries of the world towards India. It is also a very important thing to be done. Then another is how far sustainable development goals that have been set, they are being implemented. Then another thing we have seen recently, which created havoc in the world, was COVID-19, a pandemic, worst type of pandemic. And what was India's role, and how India has helped in fighting this COVID 2019. Another thing is Professor Paricha also referred on the sea, Indian Ocean or Pacific Ocean. So how far we agree with the international law with regard to this ocean. And finally, how can India get its position in the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member? It is a major challenge for India. Many countries are supporting our cause, but you know, China is opposing it. So if India gets into United Nations Security Council as a permanent member, our role will be definitely more than what it is today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chaudhary, for your well. I have some issues with my network. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes,
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 yes, sir.
Okay, okay, thank you. So I thank Professor Chaudhary for his exposition on the talk of uh, Professor Paricha, and also he very clearly pointed out what are the challenges that we have today and how we can tackle those challenges. And also he pointed out a beautiful point towards the end that the dynamics of Indian foreign policy will change if India can come up good with a seat in with a permanent seat in the Security Council. So we all hope for best days, beautiful days for India to come, and the foreign policy being shaped in a new direction. So hoping for good days ahead. And thank you, Professor Chaudhary, for beautifully putting the points in a very clear and precise manner. Thank you so much. Well, we have with us many professors. Anybody who is interested, they may kindly unmute and have their observations. Anybody. I don't know many of them are here, but anybody who is interested. Yes, we have D Pramod. Okay, sir, please, uh, if you have any suggestion or any query or any question that you carry in mind regarding India's foreign policy, and we'll be very much happy. Well, I don't find anybody. Well, okay. So, sir, till somebody has a question. Well, towards the end, I think somehow what I could understand that somehow you are not. It seems I don't know that you are not too much happy with the current state of affairs, the way India is going in its foreign policy. Uh, um, what do you think? Well, I don't know towards the end because today my network is not that good, but as I could infer from the language that you carried on towards the end, somehow you expressed a sort of dissatisfaction with regard to India's foreign policy. But how do you take this? Well, please, what would
Will you please repeat again, though?
actually your voice is not clear to me, sir. Please, hello,
Yes.
yes, sir. Please, do you have any dissatisfaction? The point that I want to make out is, do you express any sort of dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs with regard to Indian foreign policy, or do you, or what is your position, or what would be your suggestion uh, for an emerging, strongly emerging foreign policy that India should have, so that it can build up good. Good relationship with the neighbors and also with the different other parts of the world.
Okay. 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 You see, in the course of my presentation, towards the end, I have presented the challenges that Indian foreign policy makers are likely to face in the coming decade. And some of those challenges also has been raised by my friend, Professor Chaudhary. I would like to deal with one or two regarding reform in the decision-making process and structural changes of United Nations and more particularly Security Council. India has been an ardent supporter of reforming the decision-making process in the United Nations because India and the developed world, they feel that since the birth of United Nations till today, the decision-making process has always favored, or the decision making trend always leads to protecting the Western interest and neglecting the popular position at international level by more particularly the developed world who feel more neglected. And I had very briefly touched because of lack of time. I had very briefly touched about the situation that emerged in 1991 and after, because that led to the emergence of economy as one of the important factor and emergence of multiple economic power in different parts of the world, and that necessitated or that led to emerging a argument that there is a greater need for, or there is an urgent need for reforming the decision making process in United Nations, more particularly the Security Council. But if we look at about the claimants for the Security Council seat in the East Asia, Japan has emerged as one of the strong claimants. In Asia, Greater Asia, if we take into account, India has emerged as a strong claimant. And if we take about economic factor as one of the dominant factor, then Brazil in South American continent has emerged as a important factor. And South Africa, it has a very peculiar argument because if you take into account region-wise membership, African continent has the largest number of members in United Nations, which is around 54. So 54 African countries are the members of United Nations, which is the largest representative as far as the continent-wise. So South Africa says that because our number is the largest in representation in terms of United Nations, so we deserve a Security Council seat. But if we take into account the equation, Russia is not in favor of Japan because of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and the islands that forcibly Japan had taken from Russia, and Russia was also forced to sell Alaska to United Nations between First World War and the Second World War. So Russia is not in favor of Japan. China is not in favor of India. Germany also has emerged as a strong claimant, and because of First and the Second World War antagonistic relationship between Russia and Germany, Russia is not in favor of granting a membership to Germany. America is playing America is playing the role of just the cat sitting on the fence. Neither it is committed nor it is negative in terms of the expanding of the Security Council membership. So that is going to be a major challenge because India has been arguing that there is an urgent need for democratizing the decision-making process of international bodies, more particularly the Security Council of United Nations. And the entire world now recognizes that it is the economic factor which is going to dominate the international issues and it is going to influence the relationship among different nations. And if you take that particular aspect, India enjoys a relative disadvantage in the economic front. As I have said that 80% of our energy security we depend on export. We have an unfavorable balance of trade. We have the largest below poverty line people, around 29% of our total population are below poverty line, which means that they are not capable of contributing anything to the nation building process. That is number one. Then number two, there is now a growing dissatisfaction among young population all over the world because of rising unemployment rate and because of the leadership, the youth all over the world today feel that the decision-making process in all the democratic countries has centered around by the people who have a older outlook and they are not capable of leading the nation to fulfill the aspirations of the people. Because if you take into account India, it is being roughly estimated that the population from the age group of 1 to 25 is around 49%. If we extend it further, that is up to 35 years, we have around 64% of the population belonging to youth as a definition in terms of international standards. So 65% of the total population, they look the world. They want a different kind of a political system which would reflect their ambitions and their aspirations. And it is a common factor all over the world that today the youth is at the crossroads, at a square, not able to know whether to move east, west, north, or south. And they are more disillusioned because there is nobody to guide him whether east is the best or the west is the best or north or the south. So they are looking for a new kind of a dynamic leadership which could provide dynamism in decision making process, which could understand the pulse of the youth. That is going to be again another important major challenge for Indian policymakers. Because why I say Indian policymakers? Because roughly around 50% of our population are within the age group or within the definition of youth. So that is for coming decade. I have already stated that for the coming decade is going to be one of the major challenging area in terms of Indian foreign policy makers, because Nehru and other leaders also always ultimately they used to say that foreign policy is ultimately the outcome of the domestic factors, and the domestic factor is intimately connected to about what is called as the foreign policy making process. America is a great example of how domestic factor influences the foreign policy outcome, beginning from First World War, or if we take into account even George Washington, the first American president, the popular sentiment when America became free was that America should be neutral. And George Washington respected the American public opinion, and he said, in matters of foreign policy, America would maintain neutrality, and that continued till the outbreak of the First World War. So it had a long history of neutrality. So what I mean to say is that we have to develop a kind of a mechanism where the public opinion is more informed about the latest emerging challenges in international politics, so that people can integrate themselves into the decision making process, and public opinion can form an one important dimension of decision making process, and that is going to be another important challenging area, because foreign policy making process is very little debated in Indian parliament, and learned participants know that Indian parliament is one such important institution which is instrumental in shaping the public opinion in the country, and an institution which is capable of influencing the public opinion. The members they discuss very little about national security issues, strategic issues, or foreign policy issues. Only when a discussion takes place, the discussion is always on partisan lines, but the parties which participate in the discussion in terms of national security interest never comes primary, and it is the partisan lines that becomes more primary. That is why we haven't yet been able to identify a particular kind of a mechanism whereby public opinion can be integrated and public opinion can form an important aspect of decision making process in molding and shaping American Indian foreign policy making process. American foreign policy makers were influenced. I will give just very briefly about one example. American public opinion was so strong against American intervention in Vietnam that America had to ultimately withdraw from Vietnam, because by the time America withdrew from Vietnam, roughly it was estimated, according to the American statement, roughly it was estimated that around 1 lakh American soldiers either were killed or become permanently disabled. So there was a protest by the widows whose husbands were killed in the Vietnam War in the White House, that America should not participate in a regional conflict where no American direct interest is involved. Same is the case of the role of public opinion in influencing American foreign policy when America decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, and ultimately it was Joe Biden which has affected, because by the time Americans took a decision to withdraw from Americans for their involvement in global war against terror, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers have lost their life and millions of dollars were spent for no purpose. So the public opinion was that why national resources should be invested in such an issue which would not generate any important national resources wealth for the advantage, and we haven't yet, so what I mean to say is that we haven't yet been able to develop that kind of a mechanism whereby there can be a greater element of integration between domestic public opinion and international relations and its linkage to the decision making process, and that is going to be another important challenge to the Indian foreign policy makers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Paricha, for a detailed analysis. Well, still one thing that comes to my mind. Well, when we talk of India's foreign policy, you somehow link India's foreign policy with the domestic conditions. The conditions say the cases of unemployment or other factors affecting the people out locally. So you say even foreign policy, even these factors are to be taken into account when we talk of the foreign policy. But if you take a case now in the present situation when the GDP rates in the major countries, the major economics, they are falling down. India has registered slowly. It is registering a rise in GDP, or rather, it has a projected rate of growth of GDP to around 6 to 7%. So even the local conditions, well, in the current times, I feel they are very conducive. So I think even when you even talked of India negotiating the war between somehow has a role to play in negotiating the war between Ukraine and Russia, and it has come up. So India's position is somehow is strongly placed when you talk of India's place in economic terms or even the political terms. It is changing. It has changed, and now it's a time when we have really come up good, asserting our position so strongly. And someone from the external world, they are looking at India for help in such crisis. And it was the first time that it has happened. How do you see this, sir? How do you see this dynamic, the change in the dynamics? How do you see this? Please, sir.
You see, it is true that GDP of the different nations are falling down, but the GDP of the different nations which has fallen down, their economy is so resilient that they have been capable of withstanding the shock of the economic slowdown, whereas Indian economy has not come to that stage which can withstand the shock that the international market would release, because we have an unfavorable balance of trade, whereas neither America nor Russia nor China, or I am talking about big powers, nor Germany or not some of the European powers, they don't have an unfavorable balance of trade. More particularly, say European nations, they don't have unfavorable balance of trade because the European Union is economically so strong that political factors are very little taken into account. It is the economic integration among the European nations which has made them to emerge as one of the strongest bloc, because their internal market, their products are marketed, around 80% of their product are marketed among the European nations first. Like I would like to say that the France is a European leader in terms of raw materials, and Britain is a European leader in terms of production of steel and industrial production. So British, sorry, France, I don't know, comes to Britain. Britain produces steel. 80% of the steel produced by Britain are sold on a single market because they have a common market, European common market. So in a single price with a single tax, they are sold, and the rest 20% are marketed are sent to international market. Whereas the other regional power which has developed such kind of a economic integrated mechanism is ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Otherwise, no other regional organization has developed such kind of a strong, balanced regional mechanism which could prevent them from the shock of economic slowdown so that their system can recover. That is going to be a major challenge which I have already presented about India's case, because I am not talking about the trends about other countries, because our main understanding of the international event is from Indian perspective, and how Indian policymakers will be facing a challenge, either meeting economic challenges or security perspectives, or defining national interest and presenting it to the world in convincing them that these are the common agendas, like say, which my friend Professor Chaudhary also has emphasized on, say, human rights, economic integration, then women empowerment. That is also going to be another important factor, because not only in India, in international population, if we take into account, around 46% of the population are women. In case of India, roughly around 50.6% of the population are women. So we cannot neglect a huge segment of a population, because their aspiration also is a integral component of the national interest, which is ultimately reflected in the decision-making process, more particularly foreign policy making process. So integrating these factors, economic factors, domestic factors, then aspirations of the people, aspirations of the youth, how to integrate them and involve them into the decision making process, which ultimately would strengthen the bargaining power, because the greater the consensus at the domestic level, greater the bargaining power of the nation at the international level. So, how to integrate the domestic public opinion and converting it into a greater bargaining power of India at the international level? The coming decade would point out about in which direction our policymakers are moving, and that is going to be one of the major challenge. That has been what is the most central focal point of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your responses. Well, I'll come back to you with my observations. Well, let's move to the views of other professors. We have with us Professor D. Pramod here. Sir, please, your views, observations, sir. Please, namaskar, sir, please.
Namaskar, sir. Sorry, I could not attend from the beginning. I'm giving my opinion about the foreign policy. Indian foreign policy, by and large, for the past 10 years is increasing very well. And throughout the world, India is open to the world and world is open to India. And a lot of people are expecting something from India. And we have a lot of problems. And people feel that problems on India are problems in the world. And the solution can be obtained only from India. People are expecting that for the past 10 years because of the present Prime Minister, great Honorable Prime Minister we have in India. And this is the main thing. And rather than the foreign policies, Indian internal policy should also be very, very strong. Foreign policy very good. Internal policy are not very good actually. That one another point we can concentrate on, another talk also. Apart from that one,
Sir, the voice is not audible, sir. Can you please be louder?
I'm sorry. It's not audible? It's okay now? Is okay, sir?
Audible, sir. Carry on, sir. Audible.
As I said, that Indian foreign policy is very good for the past 10 years because of Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And whole world is looking at India now. And India is open to the world is open to India. And people are coming to India because we have some strong relations we have with foreign countries. And India is rich for the spiritual activities. People are coming to India to learn the spiritual activities. We have to develop the spiritualism also, one aspect. Another aspect is that, and rather than Indian foreign policy, India should also control internal policy matters. Internal policy matter very dangerous for the country, especially what things are going through the world, India now. That's another aspect we can discuss next time also. And another point I would like to take that the education research activities, international education exchange programs should be updated more and more, and should be more facilities because the faculties actually. And I see that ICCSR and ICPR, other organizations give very small fellowships, scholarships to go to foreign countries. And that should be increased actually. Most of the people going to abroad, settling down there only, they're not coming back. Like we faculties, professors and assistant professors, they should go to some 1 month or 2 months, learn something from there, implement it. That education exchange program should be increased. And we should request the government, and that must be made. Some sort of each college can be given at least 2% can be go to foreign countries. If education exchange program there, we can implement what is going abroad. We can implement our countries. And plus, as I said, the spiritualism, people are coming to India to only spiritualism, sir. Artificial intelligence, data science well developed in the country. They may not come to India. They are coming to India because India is very strong in the spiritualism. Even all the Nobel laureates, those who got the Nobel prizes, they have come to India. They learn our Bhagavad Gita, spiritual activities. Whenever we talk about the consciousness, they are failing. When we talk about the soul, they are failing. But once they come and discuss with our professors, with our saints and sages, they are highly convinced. So that Adhyatmic Gnanam should be increased more and more. That should be main aim of the one of the foreign policy should also update it. This is my observation, sir. I'm not very political man, but I'm a philosopher of my spirituality. Thank you, sir, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Pramod, for sharing your views. Thank you so much. Well, your views will be taken along with somebody who comments. I request Professor Radhanath Bera sir to respond with his observations, suggestions. Well, I request also Paricha sir to take note of what Professor Pramod has said and address jointly to what Radhanath Bera says and Bera sir says, and also to Dr. Pramod. Well, I request now to have his observations. Namaskar, sir, please.
Namaskar. I'm sorry I was out for lack of network in my area for about a half an hour. It was a very beautiful talk spanning several decades of India's foreign policy. Professor Paricha is too much biased by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and ought to be. Reason being, the first Prime Minister who shaped the destiny of the country for some 17 years or so, he could not be rejected. And the way he shaped the foreign policy is still followed by many of the successors, including Mr. Narendra Modi. Although he talks loudly, denigrating the Nehru family and so on and so forth, still then, within his heart of hearts, India can never drift from Panchashik, the land, and the peaceful coexistence, no war policy, non-aggression, and so on and so forth. Although the Australian Prime Minister declared Mr. Modi as our leader, still we are following sort of leadership. Now, one interesting part comes to my mind, although I am not a student of political science, as a citizen of India, an old citizen of India. I remember one interesting talk by Prime Minister Nehru in the parliament. Someone attacked him for being a despotic ruler in the garb of a democrat. You are shaping foreign policy with a high hand. Mr. Nehru funnily said, no, no, no. I shape my foreign policy after consultation with the foreign minister. Interestingly, Prime Minister Nehru was also holding the portfolio of foreign minister. So the two persons combined in one and they shaped. Anyway, my point of argument to Professor Paricha, I know him from a very long distance. While I was doing my MPhil and subsequently PhD in mathematics department, I used to see the first grade political science professor, Professor Janad, Professor Barad, and so on. And second, Professor Vishnu Chaudhary, Professor Paricha, and so on and so on. So now the question is, now many nations are disgruntled just because they are deprived of the Security Council permanent membership. It is almost an arbitrarily chosen thing, although in 1945 onwards, we have not faced a major crisis to split the UN, particularly on its dealing with or averting war crisis everywhere. Still, something is coming to a breaking point. Professor Paricha may not agree with it. India, Japan, even Brazil, South Africa, these nations who are ambitious enough to hold a permanent seat in UN along with the veto power, can they not walk out of the ambit of UN, form a parallel, say, uh, league, League of Nations type or security like that, and who certain prominent members like Russia and others to its port and establish a permanent world body? Is it possible? Second, India has become nuclear, a very powerful strategy for India is a nuclear country. Even if its economy is shaky on a bad footing, GDP is less, as my esteemed previous speaker said. Send professors and teachers from every college abroad. What is your GDP, sir? Are you spending 5%, 6%? It is less than 3% on education sector. Can you afford to send lakhs of professors abroad and get their technical viewpoint? It's not possible. So let us be realistic. Because Nobel laureates are coming to India and learn things which are ethical, which are also spiritual. That doesn't mean that in the present day context we can become a superpower like the erstwhile Russia, USSR, or the present USA. So my point would be, is it time that UN should break down in favor of smaller nations and create a body along with the veto power? And whether our nuclear force would be a compensation for our shaking economy? Please clarify.
Thank you. I would first take
Professor
up.
Paricha, please clarify.
Yes. I would first take up the presentation or the observation made by Dr. Kumar. He had referred to India knowledge system. I agree partially with him, but India knowledge system was discussed, debated, and became an integral part of the Indian political system in ancient days. The conditions that prevailed during those days were different, and the conditions today that prevail at international level were different. Even during those days, even Kautilya talked about Saptanga theory and Mandal theory, which is an integral part of the formulation of diplomatic policy and strategic policy. Mandal theory is nothing but uh, different theories of warfare and how to counter the different strategies and enemies depending upon the capability of the nation. That is one aspect. So I don't disagree that Indian knowledge system had enriched ancient India, but my presentation doesn't denounce the importance of Indian knowledge system, but somehow I don't foresee any kind of a effective possible link between Indian knowledge system to that of formulating that and making it an integral part into the decision making process at international level, because Indian knowledge system, more particularly, I am talking about Kautilya's Mandal theory and Kautilya's different diplomatic aspects and his advice to the king about how to deal with enemies and classification of enemies and so on. That was definitely an integral part of Indian knowledge system. But even that was never practiced during Kautilya's period, although it consisted a component part of Kautilya's writings, whether it was Arthashastra or different other theories that he has developed. So that has never been put into test. So we cannot squarely say that Indian knowledge system is the best system to deal with the diplomatic aspects and that can be made as an integral part. True, Western intellectuals visit to India, that doesn't mean simply or that doesn't place simply India as an intellectual global leader. We had our past, but let us keep that past. Don't try, let us not bring that past into the present, because that would create a greater amount of communication gap in understanding about the situation in which those theories were developed, and now the challenges that the policymakers are face are a different nature altogether. Then about Dr. Rahat Behra's presentation, I had already discussed about the dilemma that the global community is facing in meeting to the claim that has been made by India, South Africa, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. In the course of my presentation, also I had already pointed out about that how different nations who have become strong claimants are not agreeable, particularly to China, United States, and Russia for different reasons, more particularly First World War and Second World War considerations. So that is going to be a difficult task. Moreover, expanding the Security Council and bringing more members as permanent members and to provide them veto power, that requires amending the United Nations Charter. And amending United Nations Charter has a difficult provision, which is not easy to meet the kind of the amended provisions that the charter provides. That is going to be a major challenge, even if there is an agreement on expansion of Security Council and granting the permanent membership to some of the countries. Whichever country becomes, that is a different question. But let us assume that an agreement is being reached or an understanding is reached between the members to grant the permanent membership. That requires the amendment of the Charter of United Nations, which has a very difficult provision, which I am not going to discuss about here because that will take a longer time than what I would expect. And regarding your second observation, it is virtually improbable to think about an alternative global organization other than United Nations organization, because bypassing the big powers, I am not talking about only America, China, or Russia, but big powers means industrially more powerful nations, economically richer nations who are capable of influencing international events. They would not support the idea, or even the idea seems to be very improbable, because if you take into account the way United Nations organization has functioned, it has not met up to the expectations of the conditions against which United Nations was formed. One of the most important objective of formation of United Nations was to end war and establish peace. War has never ended. Peace is eluding, and the foreign policy making process of almost all the countries is centered around establishing peace and preventing war. And if we make an independent assessment without having a bias to any kind of ideology or any kind of issue, it would automatically, we would come to a conclusion that peace, which has been a substantial part of the foreign policy making process or national interest, promotion of national interest of all the member nations of the United Nations, peace has eluded, war has never ended. After the end of the Second World War till today, if we take the West Asian crisis, I have to check the statistics, but I had checked the statistics about 2 months ago, and the statistics says that minor, mini, and major wars from 1945 to till to date, there have been around 3,000 wars, and all those 3,000 wars were localized wars. But today's international situation has become so fluid that war may be taking place at a local place, but its impact is global. So localized event has a global impact, and my understanding of international politics for the last 40 years that I have been teaching, my understanding is that no nation has ever tried to understand, to formulate their foreign policy making process, how to deal with these kind of intricate policy making process of how to establish peace and how to avoid war. I had referred at the beginning of my presentation Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia, one of the important objectives of Treaty of Westphalia was to establish an international order where Committee of Nations would behave in a more civilized manner. And that civilized behavior has never been possible from 1648 till to date, because from 1648 till to date, if we take into account different conflicts and different controversies, we find that the war that has taken place, the tension that has originated in different parts of the world, that has been more because of personal whim, personal interest of the different leaders who have led the nation at different times, beginning from 1648 till today. Then it is because of a personal interest and personal motive has become one of the important component of formulating policy making process. That is the reason why for the last 400 years, decision making process in almost all the countries has become highly centralized, and highly centralized decision making process doesn't go positively with establishing peace or eliminating war. Around 30 years back, I had visited Calcutta, and there was a huge billboard which still etches in my memory. If you want to live in peace, you must understand war. So I would end up by concluding saying that there is now a greater need for understanding what is war. And once we understand what is war, we can perhaps bring a permanent peace. And that is what has been eluding the policymakers. That is what is my presentation, and I conclude. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your observation. Well, Dr. Behra, I will come back to you. Well, sir, two things. Two different things. One, that there was a time when we had an opportunity, because as you could see, yes, the situations in which we faced we got our independence, and the leadership that framed the foreign policy, well, it was a great mark of respect for the nation, because we have been sustaining with that policy. But the thing, we had an opportunity in the past when we were offered a permanent seat in the Security Council. So what was the reason? What was the mindset then that made Indian leaders to turn down that opportunity? Number one. And as a political scientist, now the things are emerging strongly, I could say, that India may get a seat in the a permanent seat in the Security Council. So two things. One, an opportunity turned down. Now an opportunity being created. You see the change in dynamics, the change in mindset. You see the decision making procedure that has been changed over the time. And I think at present, without having an indication, whoever is in the government, I see a change, a marked change, a strong mindset with clear perspective in mind, with a clear vision in mind. So this is how the dynamics have changed, and it has changed positively. So how do you see the turning down of an opportunity and the creating of an opportunity to be a permanent member in the Security Council? So this is one. Please, your observations, sir. In brief, sir, because we have other people to take on. So in brief, please, sir. Dr. Paricha.
Yes. As far as my understanding is concerned, one, you have referred to about offering the seat of the permanent membership of the Security Council. There was certain conditions attached to it. The first condition that was attached to it was that India would not strongly claim the Pak-occupied Kashmir, which India still has made an international issue, and Pakistan also has made an international issue. That is number one. And number two, there was a condition for agreement between India and China on the Chinese occupied regions which China has forcibly occupied when we lost the war in 1962. So those were some of the important objectives, and India said that we will accept the permanent member. As far as I remember, Jawaharlal Nehru said that we will accept the membership of the permanent membership of the Security Council without any condition attached to the offer. As long as the condition attached to it is offered to us, under no circumstances we are going to accept the membership with conditions. That is the reason why India did not generate any interest. India did not generate any interest when such kind of a condition is created. And now it is India which is creating a condition that it is capable of becoming a membership and capable of influencing and democratizing the decision making process, which is not acceptable to the West, because India's claim is now weaker because of its economic capability. German's claim is more stronger because Germany is economically more powerful than India. Japan is economically more powerful than India. Brazil is economically more powerful than India. So, and South Africa, it's, as I have already pointed out, that South African claim is based on a different perspective. South Africa says that since we represent the largest continent of membership in United Nations, 54 in all, so we are qualified to become a membership of the Security Council. So that is a different issue. But three major claimants: Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil. And if we take these four countries, India is definitely at a disadvantageous position in convincing to the international community simply because of its economic disadvantage that India enjoys. And until and unless that economic advantage, and Germany and Brazil more particularly have used economic potential to convert it into a diplomatic strength. And Germany enjoys stronger support of other European countries, more particularly Britain, which is a permanent membership of the Security Council. Whereas India's membership has never been supported by any permanent member of the Security Council. We have to take that into also a consideration, because when your claim is being discussed, the normal approach is that it has to be supported by, it gets more credence when it is supported by either one or two important members. The Germans' claim would be more supported by France and Britain, which are the members of the Security Council. Whereas when India projects, number one opponent will be China, Russia, and America, though they say in different international fora that we support India's claim for the membership of the Security Council, but there is a big question mark about their real intention of allowing India to become a member of the Security Council, because America and Russia have to be influenced by different considerations. Because let us assume that India becomes a member of the permanent membership of the Security Council with veto power, along with Russia, America, and China. Russia, France, Britain, and America are skeptical about India going along with them on certain international issues where their national interest is involved. That is going to be a very big question mark. So they believe that India is not that much economically capable of convincing them that it has the capacity to promote and protect their national interest in Security Council. And India has to create that kind of a situation to make realize, more particularly United States, France, and Britain, three important powers whose support is extremely essential for India to become a permanent membership of the Security Council. And that, I think, we have to go for a long way. We We have to go. We have to wait for a long way that to happen. And my understanding is that under no circumstances, United Nations Charter is going to be amended to expand the permanent membership of the Security Council. Whatsoever stronger claim that may be made by different members, howsoever intense discussion may be taking place at different fora in international level, expansion of Security Council is going to be a remote possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your views, but I somehow differ. We should not be too much bothered whether we really get into acquire the permanent seat or not, but that we got into that format to a position where we assert our seat, our presence there in the Security Council as a permanent member, we have asserted this positive change that has come over the years. That is a great change in the foreign policy, I think, because such a thing did not happen in the past. Things are happening. We cannot think of everything happening on a in a bloom. It will take time, but the assertion, the strong assertion that has come out in the international scenario, the emerging trends about Indian situation, the emerging importance that has been attached to India's presence in the Security Council. So these are the points that we should be happy with, and we should not think too much well what would be the outcome. That we are there as a contender, that's a great satisfaction to the Indian minds, and that is how we should move on. That is my observation. Well, you may differ. Thank you so much, sir. But anyway, we have others. Anybody having other some views or suggestions, I invite. Well, we will come back to you, sir. Professor Paricha. Anybody? Dr. Behera, please. This would be the last, because then we will have. Yes, please, sir. Dr. Behera. In brief, sir, because we are already at 8:40. In brief.
Okay. Okay. An English poet has already said, if you want peace, be prepared for war. It is just a contradiction of terms, spirit, and language. The League of Nations was dissolved, rather it broke down with the advent of Second World War. So a situation may arise when the Third World War, which is almost knocking at the doors, should be a fact and should emerge from the ashes of the Second World War. United Nations may be shattered to dust. In that case, as Einstein predicted, we will not be able to use another powerful bomb, etc., because nuclear power would be destroying the whole Earth. And in the Third World War, we would be reduced to barbarism with only stones and sticks to beat with. That's a different story. So I think it is better if, for example, Russia prevents Japan but promotes India. China rejects Indian claim but supports Pakistan, knowing pretty well that Pakistan would not be allowed to enter into Security Council. So these are some of the checks and balances. So you have to make a force entry. What was the situation of England or France during 1945 when the Second World War was declared to be closed? Their economy also adverse as ours is. So they could claim a membership permanently with a bit of power tagged to it. Why not India in the present context? So let us not beat our heart about this, because the big superpowers who do not want our presence would be just consoling us. Consolidate your financial position, emerge as a superpower, because already in the software sector, you are a very powerful country. China has a hardware component. So these two Asian giants would be world leader in a few years. So that is the sort of consolation we may derive from all the permanent members of Security Councils. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much for all the illuminating discussion we had from our two professors of political science. because we know certain things as citizens of a country, as we actually we are we may not be an international person, but still then we guard our own interests. So, keeping India in view, let us not rush after a permanency, consolidate our position. Economically, let us be vibrant, more powerful, and nuclear power is there in our behind, and no one can threaten us. Peaceful coexistence also demands that we should try to pose as a sort of superpower before anybody forces any attack on our territory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Behera, for your observations. Well, we should have asked Professor Paricha to respond, but it will take long. It is already 8:45. Well, I request our admin, Professor Das, to have his observations. Um, Thank you, everybody. Well, I request Professor Das to have his observations. Namaskar, sir. Namaskar. Please, your observations.
Namaskar. Namaskar. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir. Audible and visible.
Yes, I have nothing to say. I simply congratulate Professor Paricha and Professor Chaudhary for having their beautiful discussion here. uh, Dr. Mahana is now absent, so he telephoned me to give vote of thanks. So I think this is the last part. Early morning today, we were discussing Professor Paricha and myself for an hour, and I told him